Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government and Americans for Limited Government Foundation. Welcome, welcome. Hello to Pharaoh's Leadership and Technology. And the question today is Biden's economy overheating? Is the inflation running too hot? And Pharaoh's Leadership and Technology says it definitely overheating. It will be just like 2008, but for a different reason this time. The Fed will turn the economy upside down to try to control inflation. I think that's really interesting. And I had my own comment there. I don't think they're trying to control inflation. Unfortunately, it's running at 7%. And they just had a meeting and they didn't even hike interest rates. Here's Susan Gum. Thank you for joining us, Susan. Quote, isn't it their goal to destroy the US economy? Well, no, I don't think the Fed is trying to per se destroy the economy. I think what they're doing is using inflation to control the national debt by using inflation. That's Adam Smith warned about this in The Wealth of Nations, that when a country's basically spending too much money and borrowing too much money, almost always they resort to inflation as a means of basically defaulting on the debt. And we've been doing that for the entire country's history. You have inflation and you have the national debt that only ever grows. Only one president ever tried to pay it off. That was Andrew Jackson, a long, long time ago. But today we want to talk about Biden. And Joe Biden has 7% inflation, pretty low unemployment, 3.9%. And then the US GDP for the year of 2021 came in at 5.7% growth. And that's, I think, the definition, textbook definition of a overheating economy. You can see here a William Warren tune from 2008, 2009 era, and it's the Democratic um, uh, donkey shoveling money into the train, the U.S. economy, which has already crashed. And you can see that they just shovel more money in. That'll get us back on track. And this never gets old. It's I think was pretty prescient. If you're looking at 2008, inflation runs hot and then you get a recession, right? Well, actually, that's a pretty strong indicator. When inflation gets north of about 5%, and we've looked at this in this particular story on the 10-year, 2-year treasuries. And the spread between them as it relates to inflation. And what I've noted is that there's about a 14-month lag time, 16-month lag time after you get to above 5% inflation that you're going to see the economy. Here's Judy. I cannot pronounce your last name, all because of Biden, Judy says. And then she also adds, Democrats spending spree is horrible. Yeah, Joe Biden spent a lot of money. You know who spent even more money? Former President Donald Trump. He had a $2.2 trillion CARES Act and then a $900 billion Phase 4 after the election that he signed that into law. So that was about 3.1 trillion under Trump. He had a 1.9 trillion stimulus under Biden, plus another 550 billion of new spending under the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill. And so he came in about 2.5 trillion on spending on the COVID stuff. So I'd say we spent way more in 2020. And so the inflation we're seeing today is both from 2020 and 2021, both of those bills. And one can argue that maybe you wouldn't have seen the same level of inflation if Trump had won or if they hadn't just not done the Biden stimulus. And that's speculative. I think that the spending, though, is definitely the problem. And it doesn't matter if there's a R or D next to that spending when you're spending trillions and trillions of dollars, more than $6 trillion of new debt since January 2020. So I think, and the Fed's monetized a good chunk of that. M2 is through the roof. It's up by about $6 trillion as well. So for every dollar that we were borrowing, we were also printing that money. And the Fed was using quantitative easing, using treasuries purchases. And now we're seeing a key economic warning indicator, the 10-year, 2-year treasuries collapsing. The spread between the two is down to 0.6. Now, if this inverts, this is predicted every recession in modern American history. And you just look at the chart and you can see in the 1970s, and the early 1980s, you see really high inflation, and that predicts recessions. And if you go back to the 1970s as well, you can see that problem. And here's the actual chart itself over on St. Louis Fed. If you want to look at 10-year, 2-year spreads and you can kind of see how it relates to inflation. This is also linked in the description to my piece on dailytorch.com. Do hit that subscribe button for YouTube here and Rumble. Ring the bell for notifications. If you go to dailytorch.com, you can also sign up for our newsletter. And here you see periods of high and 10-year, 2-year treasuries collapsing a few months, usually about a year or so before and going into inversion. What's happening here? The short interest rates are getting higher than the longer term interest rates. So people are dumping 2-year treasuries. They're holding on to their 10-year treasuries right now, though. And as a result, the 10-year, 2-year is collapsing. And that, again, it predicts recessions. And so is Biden leading us into another recession? I think the 7% inflation absolutely predicts that problem, and that this could be a huge thing. Who do we owe this money to? In the first place, we owe it to ourselves. A good chunk of the national debt is held by the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. Then there's the debt that's held by the public. The Federal Reserve itself owns several trillion of that. If you want, we could look that up. That's called the H41. This is a chart you can look up on Google, and what it will give you is factors affecting Federal Reserve balances. And what this will do is tell you on any given date how much paper is the Fed holding. So we'll go to the most recent reading on this, and you can see here that U.S. Treasury bonds, the Fed owns about $5.7 trillion of a $30 trillion national debt. The intergovernmental holdings, it's about that much too. So another $6 trillion is held by the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. So you got more than $10 trillion that's held by the federal government of the national debt. So we're literally kind of printing money on the Federal Reserve side to do quantitative easing. And that's $5.7 trillion. That's a lot more, by the way, than they had back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So you have $5.7 trillion now. They also own about mortgage-backed securities, $2.6 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. And if you want to go back and see what we held prior to the pandemic, your eyes are bulge out of your heads. Here we go. Go back to January 2020, before COVID was really a problem in our minds. And the Federal Reserve had 2.3 trillion. So we went from 2.3 trillion to 5.7. So they printed $3.4 trillion to paper over all of that debt since the COVID pandemic began. I think that's pretty outrageous, don't you? And inflation's running really hot as a result of all of that spending. And the U.S. economy looks like it's about to overheat. That's a huge problem. Let's say hello to Mr. Smith. Yeah, but with President Trump, we actually saw results and got something for our money instead of billions upon billions just disappearing. That's a really good point. In April of 2020, at the height of the COVID lockdowns, we had lost 25 million jobs. And before the end of the year, before President Trump had even left office, we had already recovered more than 16 million of those jobs. And, we've recovered several more. I think there's about 3.5 million jobs left to be gained from the 25 million that were lost. But Trump gained way many more jobs in 2020 recovered than Biden recovered in 2021. So with all of this spending, it was a cycle of diminishing returns. And you can make an argument that, oh yeah, Trump might have come in and you'd see a different stimulus bill at the beginning of 2021. Although I recall he was asking for more checks for households. And I think that, he might have wanted to spend more money. So just because, Biden won doesn't mean that only because Biden won, we're having a recession now. It's quite possible that if Trump had won, you could be seeing this same recession warning light go off right now. And instead of Democrats worried about the congressional midterms, Republicans would be worried about the congressional midterms. So the second terms, or better yet, after a president is elected or reelected, we have the midterm congressionals that come 2 years later. Usually the out party, the opposition party, the party that's not in the White House, gains about 30 seats on average in the House. This goes back all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, back to 1904, I believe, and about 3 seats on average in the Senate. So that's more than enough for Republicans, I think, to regain Congress. And I don't think this recession is really going to help Biden, even if it's just an economic slowdown right now. And oh, by the way, the GDP Now forecast, this is the Atlanta Fed. If you go to atlantafed.org, this is the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. They have a projection for economic growth. And for the first quarter, they had just gotten a 6.9% reading on the Bureau of Economic Analysis on the gross domestic product for the fourth quarter. Now they're saying it's going to be 0.1 for the first quarter. Well, that's just terrible. That's really crappy. And so I think that they're already kind of looking at these 10-year, 2-year spreads, and they're saying, oh, this is not good. Joe Biden's economy is overheating right now, and the Fed's going to start hiking interest rates probably in March. That's what CNBC, Bloomberg, and a lot of other financial outlets are reporting right now. So there's a lot that could happen. Let's see here, Judy. But us retirees paid all this money in to support us in our later years that should be secured for us. No one should be dipping into it like Nancy Pelosi did. She needs to pay us that back. Well, here's the thing with the national debt and purchasing treasuries. The trust funds are actually earning interest on those treasuries. And so they're making money on the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, which keep getting bigger every year because it's technically running a surplus. And sometime in the not so distant future, they're projected to start running deficits, and then the trust funds will be drawn down. Basically, they'll be selling the treasuries to the market and then using that money to pay off benefits. Suffice to say, if they weren't earning interest on the treasuries that are in the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, those trust funds would have basically gone bankrupt many, many years ago. The fact that it's earning interest is the only thing that's keeping it afloat after all of these years. Suffice to say, though, I do expect that it's going to start to draw down. And you're going to see those trust funds, the amount of treasuries in them, start to dwindle. And then what will happen is we'll just roll that over probably into the regular national debt. It'll just come out of the general fund. The Fed will print the money, or foreign countries will lend us the money. But I don't foresee any decline in benefits or anything like that. Because Congress will more than likely intervene long before then. And I expect they'll spend a ton of money in that process. And so, kind of watch out. But I did want to give you some insights about what's interesting about the 10-year, 2-year spread right now, or better yet, with inflation running at 7%. In past history, you would expect interest rates to rise, particularly long interest rates, 10-year treasuries or 30-year mortgages. But mortgage rates are really, really low. I just refinanced my mortgage. I just got really low interest rates, like 1.99% and it's like an adjustable rate mortgage. You can get a fixed rate mortgage, and the interest rates are really, really, really still very low, even though inflation's running that 7%. And that's a paradox. And I wanted to recommend a piece for you guys, Big Crash Coming According to Treasury Yields. This is by Rida Morwa on Seeking Alpha. You can check out this website, Seeking Alpha. And he points to a paradox in the data. We are seeing an interesting phenomenon, he says, unseen in modern times. Inflation, as measured by U.S. personal consumption expenditures, is running well above 10-year Treasury yields, resulting in significant negative real yields. Take a look at this chart since the year 1990. He shows us a bunch of data here. Well, inflation is so high and persistent that even Jay Powell stopped using the word transient, yet the 10-year Treasury yield is around 1.5%. This is confusing many investors who are asking themselves, are we heading for a deflationary environment? Are we heading into a recession? This is a very interesting phenomenon, and it's only been seen 3 times in the past 120 years. I was astounded when I found this. I didn't realize how rare this type of event was in economic history. And it happened during the Civil War, before and after, during and after World War I, and during and after World War II. So when you spend a lot of money on a wartime footing, as Trump and Biden did to combat COVID, and that is trillions and trillions of dollars. I think it's by far the most expensive stimulus in American history was the CARES Act in 2020 and the Biden stimulus in 2021, plus the phase 4 at the end of 2020. And you're seeing a massive amount of spending, and it's leading to the inflation. Let's see here. Judy, again, where is our IOU saying we would refund our Social Security income for years ago? Now they just dip in whenever they please. This must be stopped. Well, it's federal law. That's why it's being allocated that way. Congress decades ago voted to do this, and it would take a vote of Congress signed into law by the president to, I guess, not, just keep the trust funds without converting them into treasuries. Just keep the cash. Don't earn any interest on it. I'm telling you, it'll go bankrupt much faster. Hey, here's Rick Manning, president of Americans for Limited Government. Mr. Smith, you are right. President Trump spent money to stop the destruction of the Main Street economy due to the government reaction to COVID. This is a very important point. And again, there were a lot more jobs, 16 million out of 25 million recovered in 2020 before Trump had even left office. And so there's an argument to be made that that was the time to kind of, reduce the unemployment benefits and to reduce spending overall. Instead, Biden comes in, he says, I need another stimulus. And on reconciliation, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, they gave it to him. And, kind of be careful what you wish for, Mr. President. Biden got what he wished for. He got a stimulus, and now he's got 7% inflation. And we could be seeing another recession. Now, the fourth time where you see inflation running much, much higher for a persistent long period of time than interest rates is happening right now. Again, only during wars, great wars, have we spent this kind of money. And then people are predicting there's going to be a recession right on the heels here. Treasury yields always tell the story, but it is the people that misinterpret them, says Moira. It is very easy for us to fall into the trap of assuming things that have been true for 20 years will be true forever. He calls this recency bias. But when you look at where we are right now, when you dig into the 1950s, there were a few cases when inflation was running higher than the 10-year Treasury rate, but those were always short-lived. If we go back further in history, we have seen cases of inflation spiking up significantly and the 10-year Treasury remaining low for a long period of time. The real yields were deeply negative as they were today. The two most obvious cases relate to World War I and World War II. And so I look at this data, and I see, with inflation running that hot, usually after it gets past 5%, you're in for, a lot of pain economically, as I think we are right now. Again, the Atlanta Fed is projecting just 0.1%, basically no growth in the first quarter of 2022. That's a recession warning. The 10-year, 2-year Treasury down to 0.61%. That's a recession warning as well. Let's see, we got more comments here. Here's Rick Manning again. It is the big spending bills in December of 2020 and the first few months of the Biden administration that have set inflation on fire. Again, that was the phase 4, $900 billion at the end of 2020, and then another $1.9 billion stimulus, and then the $550 billion infrastructure bill. Here's Rick again. Democrats have been dipping into Social Security since they changed the law to allow for it under LBJ, all to fund the Vietnam War. That's how it started, and that's the way it's been ever since, unfortunately. For or you could say it's good for the Social Security Trust Fund to be earning interest. I guess that's controversial. I know it's a talking point. I also know that's how we're funding not only Social Security, but disability benefits, Medicare, of course, and supplemental security income for seniors and those who are disabled who collect that as well. And so I think those programs are probably, I don't think they're going anywhere, part of the so-called mandatory spending. But these big spending bills, Rick is right. That is why we are in this mess right now. It's why I think that you're going to start to see some of these recession warning lights flashing over the next several weeks and months. If you look at the GDP Now forecast, there's actually a reading here on the manufacturing numbers that just got released. If you go to the release dates on this, it tells you all of the data that Atlanta Fed actually tracks. And so today we're at 2.1. Here you go. ISM, manufacturing index, construction spending. So construction spending and the manufacturing index was nothing in that data told the Atlanta Fed that anything good's going to happen in the first quarter. So they're still projecting zero growth. And then the way it works is every time another one of these estimates come out, so you'll have international trade, a full report in 1 week. So we can kind of do another recession watch in a week if you guys want, when this international trade report comes out. And then we can just kind of keep an eye on this, because you got the first quarter will end at the end of March. And then, a couple weeks or so after that, you'll see the first GDP number. And then you get to see, what's the Atlanta Fed right? Could we even be heading for a recession right now? And it's a very interesting question. And again, the 2-year treasury is kind of what's leading up this 10-year, 2-year collapsing. So you see here beginning in October and November, I think with especially in December with I think Omicron uncertainty, but really what's happening is the Fed slowing down the amount of purchases it's doing of short-term US treasuries. They get out of the market and suddenly market interest rates say I need to earn more than 0% in order to justify a 2-year treasury purchase. And then you look at the 10-year treasury, though, it's been rather flat and it's hovering at 1.8%. So once the 2-year treasury, if it does, gets greater than the 10-year treasury, then you could pretty much set your watches and say, oh, in 15 months or whatever the average amount of time it is after a 10-year, 2-year inversion, there's going to be a recession. And so if that happens, the inversion this year, you could expect to see a Biden recession as soon as this year, and all the way out to 2023 or even 2024, when either he or whoever his successor is standing for election on the Democratic side. And so that can be it could have huge political ramifications. And in 2022, I think that's when you're going to see the real most ramifications. So if Biden has any asset right now, it's time. Time is on his side if he gets a recession early in his first term. Ronald Reagan in 1982 had a massive recession as we were leaking out the inflation from the 1970s. But by 1984, the economy was fully recovering, and Ronald Reagan went on to win a 49 state landslide. But in 1982, that was a pretty deep recession, had pretty high unemployment, and high inflation preceded it. And so things didn't look too good for Reagan back then, but there was enough time to recover. So the question for Biden is maybe he would rather see a recession right now rather than later, because you have examples of George Herbert Walker Bush having a recession in 1990 and 1991 that led to his downfall in 1992. Gerald Ford, he had a recession in 1975. He was ousted in 1976. Jimmy Carter had a recession in 1980. He was ousted that year. So recessions and first-term presidents is a toxic combination. It nearly defeated Ronald Reagan, and it defeated Bush, Carter, and Ford. So it could be that you get 2 consecutive one-term presidents. By the way, the last time that happened was Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. And it's also the only other time you had a 2 non-consecutive term president, Grover Cleveland. And now you might have that happening too, as former President Trump is considering running again. That could be an interesting rematch, perhaps, of 2020, something to keep your eyes out for, especially with the economy weakening. Does that make Trump more likely to jump in if he thinks that his chances of winning are actually pretty high? When you look at non-consecutive, someone who lost re-election and then went on to run again, Grover Cleveland actually won. Maybe being a former president would help him. Who knows? Let's see. We have a lot of comments here. Here's Judy again. They keep threatening us about going broke constantly. That's true. The national debt keeps getting greater and greater. And the default, everyone predicts a default. I'd say the default is ongoing. Every time we print money by the Federal Reserve, according to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, that's technically a default. You're printing money to pay the debt. And you don't have to actually default. All you need to do is water down the investments of anyone who bought treasuries before this year. Here we go with Mr. Smith. Biden's still handing out money like it's candy. If you're getting unemployment, why do you deserve $300, $400, $600 extra a week? Actually, that program ended. And the Build Back Better plan, which would bring some of that back, is basically legislatively dead right now. I think one of the reasons that Atlanta Fed, investors on Wall Street are projecting perhaps a recession this year is because government stopped spending. So now you're going to see how strong is the economy really after COVID, after the lockdowns, after all of this spending, after the inflation, with the supply chain crisis. I think you can see some very suddenly very weak numbers, particularly on consumer inflation. If you see any negative numbers on consumer inflation, deflation, watch out. Markets hate that. Unemployment could go up very rapidly under a circumstance like that. But if inflation kind of just goes down to 2% or 1% annualized, then maybe it won't be such a bad weakness in the economy. Excuse me. And so let's see, we're coming up on 24 minutes here. We got some more comments. Here's Judy. Exactly. Biden wants to kill America and is against our Constitution. Also, don't allow the Democrats to change our voting laws. So there is no IDs. So all those illegals can vote for them. Keep our voting laws the same for only Americans can vote in our elections. Yes, it is. That is federal law. You have to be a U.S. citizen to vote in a federal election. And various states have state voter ID laws that are going to be very important, not just in 2022, but in all election cycles. And then you have other states that have more lax, and particularly in 2020, had more lax mail-in voting and absentee voting. Will we see as much absentee voting in 2022 as we did in 2020? Not only do I expect not to see as much absentee balloting this year, I expect to see fewer people voting, which is usually what happens in midterms. But I do expect that Republicans will be just a little bit more fired up than Democrats because of the midterm cycle. You already saw the red wave starting to build in New Jersey. Republicans nearly captured the governor's mansion there, and they won it in Virginia for the first time in more than a decade. A pretty remarkable accomplishment there for Glenn Youngkin here in my home state of Virginia. And so you can see this red wave building up right now. Here's Mr. Smith again. It's still happening. Maybe not with unemployment, but everyone with kids are getting money every month for nothing. Why would they work, especially the baby makers and those who took in illegals? Well, I'll dispute that slightly just because I think that unemployment is getting really low. As a matter of fact, actually, I want to go to data. If you go to data.bls.gov, this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can actually look at things like unemployment, historical unemployment. So there you go. Unemployment currently, as of this December, 3.9%. That's pretty darn low, I gotta say. In 2018, when Trump was getting 3.9% unemployment, the president was talking up the economy big time and saying that these are huge numbers. The difference was Trump had really low unemployment and really low inflation. Biden has a rapidly declining unemployment rate coming off of the COVID as the economy was reopening, but he has really high inflation. And so I think that's a huge difference there. And usually when the Fed sees unemployment getting into the fours, and they only had 3 months in the fours and it went straight to 3.9. We'll see. We'll get another jobs report at the end of this week on Friday. There'll be a new jobs number coming out. Here's Rick Manning again. Mr. Smith. Fortunately, the federal program dramatically overpaying the unemployed ended in September. States which ended it saw early big drop in unemployment versus those that kept it till September. And so here's another important point. If the federal government had removed the supports sooner, could we have experienced more mild inflation? Would Biden have gotten a longer recovery? Could we have seen unemployment get even lower? Could it get lower than where Trump had it? Trump had it down to 3.5% in February of 2020, right before the pandemic. So we're already back to 3.9. But I also think you're at the kind of the latter end of this current business cycle. Whether you want to say it's the Trump business cycle that Biden inherited, because there was a big pause in the business cycle because of COVID. You could look at it that way. 10-year Treasury might agree with you, because when you look at the 10-year Treasury most recently, it only peaked up to, what does that say? 1.3%. You'll have a hard time reading that on your screen, but it peaked at 1.3% and then is already down more than half, down to 0.61%. And so that's the peak of the business cycle, and it comes in April of 2021. And that's, by the way, when the inflation really started taking off. Peak business cycle, inflation starts taking off. As inflation takes off, I did this correlation on my piece about a Biden recession, is that when inflation goes up, the 2-year Treasury has an inverse relationship with that, such that if you experience high inflation, eventually expect a recession. In 2008, you saw it. In 1990, at the end of the 1980s, and in 1991, you saw higher inflation peaking right before the recession. 1982, the 70s, etc. You always see the economy overheating before you get to the recession. And usually you're at peak employment at that time. And so just those two factors, if you look up Investopedia, it defines what a overheating economy is. I think I actually have it in this piece. If I can find it, it might have been in a different piece. Basically, it's peak employment and high inflation. So you have really low unemployment and really high inflation, like Biden does. You might be seeing a recession very, very soon, and that could make him almost. It could make it much more likely that he becomes a one-term president. And on that note, if there are no more chats, I did want to leave you, with a few things here. Oh wait, here's Rick Manning again. Got to let Rick Manning. Maybe we'll let Rick get the last word here. The federal payment for children ended at the end of 2021. Democrats and some Republican members would like for it to be reinstated. ALG opposes this upper and middle income class welfare payment being restored. So yeah, during the COVID pandemic, there were some very important small business administration loans that went out to help, pizzerias and local restaurants and other small businesses basically not go bankrupt because state and local governments shut down the economy. And so it was a planned recession in that respect. Everyone knew that the economy was shutting down. And so President Trump requested all of those additional supports, and not just for small businesses. Congress wanted, supports for people that have extended unemployment, which, citizens in every single state of the country took advantage of. Red states, blue states, everyone saw massive job losses. And some saw more rapid recoveries, as Rick notes, after the pandemic, closures were ending, and states that ended their extended unemployment benefits sooner seem to have picked up a little bit more jobs. Although most of the jobs are already back from the jobs that were lost. We're almost back to pre-COVID levels in terms of jobs. But that's pretty much what I wanted to say for the live stream here. I wanted to thank everyone who tuned in and gave us a try over here at Americans for Limited Government, on our YouTube channel, on Facebook, on our Rumble channels. Please, wherever you're watching, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, hit the like button, share this video out. And this is, I hope, educational when you're talking about complicated issues like the 10-year, 2-year spread and what does that mean. You can research these topics yourself. If you subscribe to dailytorch.com, you get this newsletter in your inbox Monday through Friday and on Saturday as well. Watch our live streams, and we're trying to grow this channel. We recently got monetized, so watch those ads. Every little bit helps. And as you interact with these videos, more people who maybe share your interests will have recommendations. Hopefully, more people will start seeing our videos if you share it more. And so I wanted to kind of close out the stream here and just let everyone know, Biden's recession could be happening very, very soon. Pay attention to your financial news reporting on this. It could impact your retirement savings, things like that. Just kind of like watch out. We watch for these warning signs. I've been with Americans for Limited Government since 2008. And so, we went through the 2008, 2009 recession. And over the years, we've researched this topic, and it's very interesting. You almost saw, and you practically had an inversion in late 2019, but it almost looked like a head fake for a imminent recession. A lot of people were predicting imminent recession in 2019, but we noticed that it came within a hair's breadth of fully inverting on the 10-year, 2-year, but then it started coming back. And I said, maybe the business cycle still got a little bit life left to it. The same thing happened in the mid 90s, where you had a brief inversion on the 10-year, 2-year, but it turned out to be a head fake. And so you say that 10-year, 2-year inversions predict almost every recession. That's one that didn't predict. Actually, the bubble of the 1990s still had a lot of steam left in it, and you saw a recession come much, much later in 2000 and 2001. I think this one's coming at a fairly rapid clip, though. This inversion, if it's going to happen, is taking place rapidly. And so kind of watch out, buckle up. Biden's recession could be happening, maybe in a midterm election near you. With that, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.